Rules and the enforcement of identity on mothers in the West. Motherhood, particularly in the Western context, is often framed within a narrow and restrictive narrative, one that ties a woman's identity to her role as a mother. This lens of caregiving is shaped by a series of societal expectations that go beyond biology, dictating how mothers are supposed to behave, what they should sacrifice, and even how they should define their worth. In this video essay, I will explore how these rules, particularly surrounding motherhood, come with layers of issues, especially when viewed through the lens of capitalism, race, and gender. But beyond simply critiquing these structures, I will also explore potential avenues for change. I will pivot to Angela Garb's Essential Labor, where we can unpack the ways that caregiving, mothering, and labor are framed, and how the systems that uphold these ideas must be dismantled. Colonial impact, the imposition of Western motherhood norms. The Western conception of motherhood is not neutral. It has its roots in colonialism. Early colonial powers imposed rigid gender roles, including the idea that mothers must bear the sole responsibility for raising children. This expectation was not only about biological reproduction, but about creating a specific social order. In Western society, biological mothers are expected to meet all child-rearing demands 24/7. This often comes at the expense of their own well-being. What's more, the idealized self-sacrificial role of mother undermines any autonomy a woman might have. When maternal wisdom was once communal, today it's often replaced by expert advice, further stripping women of agency over their own parenting choices. This framework doesn't just limit how mothers parent, it limits who they are. The biological misrepresentation of motherhood and the enforcement of hegemonic roles. In the West, motherhood is often portrayed as biologically inevitable and even natural, a defining feature of being a woman. The cultural narrative insists that a mother's worth is defined by her ability to have children and raise them in the right way. This is not just a social construct, but a biological misrepresentation that ties womanhood directly to caregiving. The concept of the good mother is framed as someone who is selfless, constantly attentive, and always prioritizing her child's needs over her own. This narrow definition of motherhood is enforced not only by societal norms, but through medical, cultural, and even legal channels. Western society tells women that to be a real woman, they must fulfill these maternal roles. Anything less is deemed inadequate. This ideal of motherhood, steeped in white, cis heteronormative values, confines women to a limited and unrealistic vision of their identity. The internalization of external messaging, limits to identity and expression. These external messages do not just exist in the abstract, they are internalized. Repeated exposure to the ideal of the good mother leads many women to believe they must meet these standards to prove their worth, whether through advertisements, media portrayals, or interactions with medical professionals. Society pressures mothers to believe their value is tied to their ability to fulfill this demanding, self-sacrificing role. Mothers internalize these ideals, often leading to feelings of guilt, inadequacy, and stress. When they inevitably fall short of these standards, because let's face it, no one can meet them, many mothers feel like failures. This internalization restricts women's identities, discouraging self-expression and perpetuating the idea that their value lies only in their ability to care for others. Women become defined not by their dreams, careers, or passions, but by their roles as mothers. The role of capitalism in perpetuating motherhood stereotypes. And where there's pressure, there's profit. Capitalism plays a significant role in perpetuating these motherhood norms. Advertisements for baby products, toys, and home goods prey on the insecurities of mothers, convincing them that to be a good mother, they need to buy the right products. The market thrives on the idea that motherhood is a performance, one that requires specific tools to be successful. From the moment women become mothers, the commodification of caregiving begins. High-end strollers, organic baby food, educational tools, products are marked with the promise that they will make mothers better caregivers. This reinforces the notion that a mother's worth is measured not only by her actions, but by her consumption. And as mothers are bombarded with this messaging, they become caught in a cycle where their worth is forever linked to material goods, further entrenching capitalist values. Western motherhood, enforcing class and status through consumption. The pressure to conform to these ideals also plays out through class. Wealthier mothers are often portrayed as more competent because they can afford the right products. They can buy the perfect stroller, hire the best tutors, or afford extracurricular activities that showcase their maternal devotion. This creates a hierarchy of motherhood where poor mothers are unfairly labeled as bad mothers for not meeting these consumerist standards. This consumer-driven model reinforces class distinctions. Wealth becomes synonymous with good motherhood, and mothers who cannot afford these luxuries face stigma. In this way, the role of mother serves as another tool for enforcing social stratification, where those who can afford to buy the right goods are deemed better, more competent caregivers, while those who can't are marginalized. Indigenous mothering as a comparison. While the focus here is on the West, it's helpful to briefly look at Indigenous perspectives on motherhood. Indigenous cultures often embrace collective, communal care, the concept of other mothers, where caregiving is shared among a community, challenging the isolating, self-sacrificial notion of Western motherhood. In these Indigenous frameworks, motherhood is not about individual protection, but about communal support. Mothers are not expected to bear the full burden alone. This provides a stark contrast to Western ideals that isolate mothers and place all the responsibility on them, emphasizing individualism over collective care. Sociological theories can help us understand how these norms are perpetuated. Conflict theory suggests that family structures reflect broader societal inequalities. Western gender roles, particularly those imposed on mothers, perpetuate these inequalities by limiting opportunities for women and confining them to domestic roles. Symbolic interactionism, on the other hand, shows us how societal expectations shape how mothers perceive themselves. The good mother narrative is reinforced through interactions with family, medical professionals, and society at large. This creates a self-fulfilling cycle where mothers internalize these ideals and adjust their behavior accordingly, often to their detriment. Angela Garb's essential labor and enforced roles. As we transition into a deeper understanding of the role of motherhood, Angela Garb's essential labor sheds light on the ways that caregiving is framed in the West, specifically its gendered and racialized nature. Garbs argues that caregiving and mothering roles have historically been assigned disproportionately to women, especially women of color, due to systemic inequities. These roles, while essential, are often undervalued and taken for granted by society. The narrative that caregiving is a natural, inescapable duty for women feeds into the idea that these roles should not be supported or appreciated by the state, but instead be managed privately by women, further reinforcing their limited identities. Garbs also critiques how Western society enforces the perfect mother ideal, an image of mothering that is selfless, all-consuming, and relentless. This ideal is impossible to achieve and creates an intense pressure on mothers. The labor involved in caregiving is not just physical, it is emotional, relational, and often invisible. Yet capitalism thrives on this unpaid labor, continuing to exploit mothers without providing the necessary infrastructure to support them, like universal childcare or paid family leave. The impact of the pandemic on mothers. The COVID-19 pandemic only exacerbated the pressures mothers face. With school closures, remote learning, and increased caregiving demands, mothers were thrust into an impossible situation where they were expected to carry the brunt of the household and caregiving responsibilities, all while managing professional obligations. This further entrenched the idea that mothers are solely responsible for the home and family, and it reinforced traditional gender roles. Garbs highlights how women, particularly mothers, were forced to prioritize caregiving over professional work, exasperating the pressures of balancing these two worlds. The pandemic served as a stark reminder of how fragile the support systems are for mothers, and how deeply entrenched these gendered roles are in Western society. Resistance and potential for change. Reimagining mothering as radical action. There is room for change. Garbs urges us to reimagine mothering as a collective, inclusive practice, one that challenges the Western enforcement of caregiving as a solely female or maternal role. When we shift the focus from individual responsibility to collective care, we can begin to dismantle the patriarchal and capitalist systems that have defined women's worth through their caregiving. Furthermore, this call for change must be intersectional. Mainstream feminism historically focused on career fulfillment for white women, often ignoring the experiences of women of color who have long been expected to perform caregiving roles. These women face both the exploitation of their labor and the added weight of racialized expectations. By amplifying the voices of marginalized mothers, we acknowledge the complexities of caregiving across different communities and push for a system that supports all women, not just those who can afford to opt into the perfect mother narrative. The need for systemic support. As Garbs emphasizes, the lack of public infrastructure for caregiving in the West forces mothers into roles that limit their ability to explore identities outside of motherhood. Without universal childcare, paid family leave, or affordable healthcare, mothers are trapped in a system that values their caregiving labor only when it's convenient for the economy. But as we've seen, this labor is far from temporary or optional. It is essential. And yet, it continues to be relegated to the private, invisible sphere. To truly support mothers, we must invest in caregiving as public infrastructure. Proposals like universal childcare and policies that value care work as infrastructure aim to free mothers from these enforced identities. This allows women to reclaim their time, independence, and right to define their roles beyond the narrow confines of motherhood. Enforcing roles and limiting identities. In Western society, mothers are defined primarily by their caregiving roles. The lack of systemic support for caregiving means that this labor remains invisible, relegated to private spheres, and undervalued. These roles are enforced through societal norms and capitalist structures that benefit from women's unpaid and undervalued labor. As Angela Garbs argues, reimagining caregiving as collective labor is key to dismantling these oppressive systems and redefining motherhood as a transformative collective practice. By embracing a radical shift in how we think about care, we can start to dismantle the systems that limit mothers' identities and opportunities. Reimagining mothering is not just about changing policies, it's about redefining the very fabric of society, one that values women, caregiving, and collective support over individual sacrifice and consumerism. Motherhood should be about choice, not obligation. Let's redefine it not as a burden, but as a shared transformative labor that can uplift all of us.